We are live and streaming across the province of Ontario. Welcome to the 2022 FEO Energize Virtual Conference. Tuesdays and Thursdays in the month of March. 25 plus speakers. Dozens of important topics. Designed to motivate and inspire you to make a triumphant return from COVID. It's time to reconnect, reimagine, and refocus. Let's get energized. This portion of the 2022 FEO Energize Conference is brought to you by the Province of Ontario, Destination Ontario, OLG, and SmartServe Ontario. Please welcome our host for the 2022 FEO Energize Virtual Conference. It's our CEO, Dave McNeil.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Tuesday, March 8th, International Women's Day. Hope everybody is enjoying a beautiful sunny day. It's sunny here in southwestern Ontario. Hopefully you're enjoying the same weather that we are. I would like to, at this time, thank all of our staff here at FEO for all of the extraordinary work they've done throughout the last 2 years of the pandemic and getting this virtual conference ready for you. Deb Mann, Jay Nyhouse, Pinky Etter, our conference chair, Marnie Lapierre, and all of our conference members, thank you for the job you do. Thanks to Ann Barker and her team at Ticket Pro for helping us get through this conference and our membership drives and everything we do. We really appreciate the work that Ann and her team puts in. We've got an action-packed session today. We also want to remind everybody at the end of the session, we'll be inducting our second Hall of Famer, so make sure you stick around and see who we're inducting into our FEO Hall of Fame today. At this time, I'd like to welcome and have Leni Brem introduce herself and speak to a little bit about what she does and introduce today's speaker and the session. Leni, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leni Brem. I work with Indigenous Tourism Ontario, which is the membership organization for Indigenous tourism operators in the province. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today to learn about and discuss a really important topic, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes called DEI or D&I or IDEA, which also includes the A for accessibility. So I'm joining this session from my home and the city I was born in, Toronto. The city that we now call Toronto is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples, and it was most recently inhabited by the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I'm grateful to share this home with many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today, or rather, I'm grateful that they share it with me. This land was part of the Toronto Purchase of 1805, which is also referred to as Treaty 13. And as Debbie put it when starting the conference off last week, a treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. So all of us are treaty people, and I honor and take seriously my responsibility to all my neighbors. And I also want to acknowledge that today is International Women's Day. March 8th is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. And the day is also, or it also marks a call to action for accelerating gender parity. The theme for this year is Break the Bias, and a description from the International Women's Day website says, whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. Knowing that bias exists isn't enough. Action is needed to level the playing field. So I'll park that aside for now so we can finally meet our expert guest. After Krystal introduces herself, we'll start the presentation. We'll have Q&A towards the end. And please go ahead and use the Q&A function in order to send in your questions. So Krystal, I pass the mic on to you.
Thank you so much, Leni, and thank you as well for doing a land acknowledgement. That means a lot to me. So, Ani Bojo, hello, my name is Krystal Abotossaway. Krystal Abotossaway Anishinaabe Andak Amnikaning Dunjiba Makwa Dudem Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao. What I've just said in my traditional Ojibwe language. Some of you in the call might have heard Ojibwe many times before, or this might be your first time. So I like to always open up in my traditional way. As Indigenous people, it's important that we recognize, again, the land that we're on, but also who we are and who our ancestors are. So I'm from Anjigami First Nations, which is where my father's from. My mother's from Rama, which is Chippewas and Minjikining. And again, I'm a proud Ojibwe woman. I'm also from the Bear Clan. Again, some traditional Anishinaabe people follow a clan system. So again, it's important that I share my clan system with you as well. Again, super excited to be here today. I plan to, from an agenda standpoint, talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. I'm going to give you maybe another quick introduction when we start the presentation about who's in front of you today as a presenter. But again, really excited to be here, Leni. And so thanks for having me as well.
Thank you for being with us today. And I will share the presentation. Are we good? You can see it?
I can see it. Hopefully everyone else can see it.
Great.
Okay, perfect. So a little bit about me, as again, I did mention where I'm from and that I am a First Nations woman. Happy International Women's Day as well. I have worked in diversity and inclusion for the last decade, believe it or not. Of course, I started when I was 12 based on how I look today. No, but all seriousness aside, I think D&I has really become a huge topic, not just in Canada, but North America. We saw a huge influx over the last 2 years when we saw George Floyd. And again, that call from the community and people of color really brought to life the importance of diversity and inclusion, not just in society, but also from that corporation standpoint, from public sector, private sector, really even how intergenerational racism is enacted and how what we can do from a professional side to really bring to life some of the diversity and inclusion of differences. And so, you know, as I mentioned, D&I, again, has been a lot of what I've pushed in both my career days. So again, from a professional standpoint, I worked at RBC for I think 6 years doing Indigenous recruitment and selection, again, and worked with a broader team in diversity and inclusion. Fast forward to now, I am a senior manager in diversity and inclusion doing Indigenous strategy for the bank. But outside of my job, I do a lot of consulting with Bay Street organizations, all I'd say from the spectrum of small, medium to large corporations. And then outside of that as well, I do sit as board president of the Indigenous Professional Association Canada. I welcome all of you guys as allies to look that organization up and see what from a partnership standpoint you can do. I also work as a board member of Misery Beak Aboriginal Employment Training Centre of Toronto, and they're doing fantastic work to scale builds Indigenous Toronto community members in all sectors, really, from trades all the way into professional fields as well. So D&I has been a big piece of the work that I've been trying to move forward in the Toronto area, as well as from coast to coast. I think there's a lot of, you know, in 1 hour, I could probably give you just 5% of my knowledge, but I want to leave you with a little bit around this umbrella of what D&I really is. You know, talk a little bit about terminology, language use, because it's super important to understand that, to be progressive in our language. Talk a little bit about cultural competencies. What are we seeing organizations do today? And again, from my viewpoint, it's just going to become amplified over the next couple of years as well. Talk a little bit about bias. We sometimes hear people talk about unconscious bias and all these different types of microaggressions. And so again, want to give you some context. I'm an expert in the field, but for some, we might just hear these in the media, or we might hear them kind of in the office, outside the office, or in virtual calls. So just want to give you some terminology there so that when you do hear it or see it, you'll have a better understanding of what it is. Next slide, Leni. I think it's one more before this one. So it's what I want to really first start the conversation with is diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, equality. So all of these things are said, but what do they actually mean? And so again, this is my own personal synopsis of what I'm thinking, how I think about it when I hear people talking about it, is diversity considers the individual and the unique characteristics and elements of a person. The different elements or dimensions of our diversity include many things, this list is not exhaustive, but race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, gender, identity, sexuality, religion, and so much more. Now, when I think about inclusion, I think inclusion considers the group. So this is the intended goal, really, of inclusion is to have all members within the group create cohesiveness to reach a desired goal. And so an inclusive workplace is one that embraces everyone's differences, which include their thought, their experiences, to create an environment that helps everyone in that group become successful. Belonging really to me is when each individual feels safe, supported, accepted, and included. And belonging really is an internal emotion that people experience in the workplace. Equity considers fairness of all individuals, irrespective of differences, experiences, and backgrounds. So an equitable workplace, of course, would then mean it provides access, accommodation, and it really looks to deconstruct barriers in the workplace. Equality focuses on equal opportunity for all employees, regardless of any of their differences. And so when I think about that, the next question is, how does this show up in the workplace? And this can be through many different avenues or many different procedures or policies. But at the highest level, I think about what can an organization do from a change agent standpoint, thinking about kind of the operations of how it's worked historically and what can we do to change it so it's more progressive. It brings in a lot of what I've just mentioned around inclusion, belonging, and equity to really stand up and look at the differences that each employee brings to the table. And from an HR standpoint, I think about what can we do from an education training standpoint. Having a conversation today is one great area that we see this, but again, there are lots of ongoing learnings and educations that we can do throughout an organization and throughout the year. The other thing too that's super important from an HR standpoint is around policy and policy development. And I guess the only action really that, doesn't necessarily hold the organization responsible, but holds the colleagues responsible is employee accountability. And what does that look like within an organization as well? Next slide. So I did mention a little bit about this before, but I want to make sure that we understand equity versus equality again, because it's super important because we use, a lot of this language you'll see in policy in the media, and really just want to make sure that equality, of course, is when processes, procedures, anything from an employee standpoint is equal and is treating everyone in the same way. But equity is when we look at breaking down specific barriers and breaking down barriers in general, as well as maybe accommodating individuals, employees, colleagues alike, in order for everyone to participate and everyone to be successful, again, in that equality standpoint. And again, the focus of this really, when we think about equity, is on fairness and the outcomes of all colleagues and employees. Next slide. So there's, I think, just one more, I think, no, it's it's the one around the dialogue around diversity. Yeah, this one, perfect, thanks. Okay, so I mentioned I'm gonna talk a little bit about terminology. There are so many, and again, language is continuously evolving. I'm going to just list and name out a couple. And again, I want you to think through if any of what I mention isn't something that you're aware of, I welcome you to maybe write it down or take a note today during our discussion and think about maybe Googling what it actually means so that you've taken that ownership to really understand some of these new diversity terminologies. So there's ally, bias, bigot, BIPOC, cisgender, colorblind, culture appropriation, decolonize, disability, diversity, as I mentioned, which everyone should know now, discrimination, equality, gender identity, gender nonconformity, harassment, implicit bias, institutional racism, intersectionality, isms, LGBTQ2+, microaggressions, multicultural competencies, oppression, patriarchy, people of color, prejudice, queer, race, safe space, sexual orientation, social justice, stereotyping, structural inequality, system of oppression, tokenism are just a couple. And again, I could probably rhyme out a list of different terminologies here. I want to talk about a couple while I have you here today, but I hope you were able to write a few of those down. And keeping in mind that this list will continuously change as we move and progress in collectively deciding what sort of titles or nuances that we need to be really thinking about, not just in the workplace, but outside the workplace as well, when we're collectively around diverse people and groups. So ally was one I thought would be a fantastic one to kind of talk about the definition, just because it's International Women's Day and there's a lot of intersectionality around diversity. I think all of you here today have taken the opportunity to come and learn about a diversity and inclusion, so I would consider you an ally for sure. But an ally really is someone who supports a group other than one's own. And in terms of multiple identities, this could be anything from race, gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, as I mentioned, and religion, etc. And an ally really acknowledges that there may be oppression and actively commits to reducing their own complicity and investigates and really works to strengthening their own knowledge and awareness of oppression, but also looks to speak out against the oppression as well. Another one I wanted to talk about is cultural appropriation. Again, really important to understand, examples of this and where we can see maybe allies taking it upon themselves to educate others around them when they see this take place. An example of this could be, the non-consensual or misappropriating use of cultural elements for common identification or profit purposes. And so this could be anything from including symbols, art, language, and customs, and usually without often understanding or acknowledging or the respect of its values in the context of its original culture. So an example that I can, that just comes to mind when I think about cultural appropriation, sometimes around Halloween, we'll see potential children wearing clothes like cowboys and Indians. Again, that Hollywood version of wearing Indian costumes, again, would be cultural appropriation to Indigenous peoples. Also, if you're wearing anything religiously, like a nun gown, that would be cultural appropriation to a specific religion, just to give an example of context. When we hear the word decolonize, another one that I see a lot with advocacy groups, and this is the active and intentional process of unlearning values, beliefs, and conceptions that have caused physical, emotional, or mental harm to people through colonization. It requires a recognition of the systems of oppression, and again, looks to seek positive ways to change how things are done within systems, processes, or even policy, really, of how organizations in the structure itself, how can we change those systems and look at how we can really work to unlearning and or breaking down the complete structure and changing it so that it's more progressive. I think the two other ones I just wanted to bring to light would be structural inequality as well as system of oppression. So structural inequality is really when systematic different disadvantages can happen within one social group compared to other groups. And it's rooted and perpetuated through discriminatory practices, and this can be either conscious or unconscious, that are reinforced through the institutions, ideologies, representations, policy, laws, and practices. When this kind of inequality is related, it usually is related to racial ethnic discrimination and is referred to as systematic or structural racism. And a system of oppression really is that conscious, again, can be conscious or unconscious, non-random and organized harassment, discrimination, exploitation, discrimination, prejudice, and other forms of unequal treatment that impact different groups, and is sometimes used as well as to be called systematic racism. And actually, I'll explain one more too, because this is something that we have to be really conscious of, is tokenism. And that's really when we have a performative presence without meaningful participation. So for example, a superficial invitation for the participants of members of a certain socially oppressed group who are expected to speak for the whole group without giving this person a real opportunity to speak for herself or himself. So we have to be really cognizant when we start to work through or do diversity and inclusion that, we're not only just having certain groups come to talk with us, but there is a very collaborative process. There's a give and take. There's reciprocity in the process as well, especially for events that, we have to ensure that there's really inclusion embedded in the process, so that again, there's no feelings of kind of maybe usage of a certain group without really, I'd say, consent or duty to consult in that right way. Slide 5, and I just wanted to touch a little bit about this because it's super important, is what are organizations doing now? Again, this is something, it's a bit nuanced. So we're seeing a lot of diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity strategies. If you were to Google right now, you would see many organizations have, 5-year commitments, 10-year strategies around D&I. And so again, if you're interested, I'd say there's an influx of information that organizations are doing. But what does that really look like from a team's perspective is really, it's reviewing the policies and procedures, as I mentioned, but it's about creating training and development opportunities for colleagues alike. So again, I think this is also known as learning management systems, but super important is that, organizations are starting to have that always on approach, which means that days of note for all diversity groups are, becoming the norm. So again, whether an organization has social media, and you might be recognizing this too. For instance, I'll give a few examples, but September 30th now is Truth and Reconciliation Day. So organizations are talking to or educating their employees on residential school system, what they can do to be an ally for Indigenous communities. The LGBTQ+ group have a lot of different days that explain what the acronym means and give lived experiences of their colleagues and how, and it's really, I think, authentic storytelling that brings to life, some lived experiences of how their sexuality or their gender has been potentially seen as, there's been prejudice or there's been, negative viewpoints, and how we're going into this new world of really respecting each other's differences, being able to bring our authentic selves to work. That means sharing all of who we are and not just pieces from a professional standpoint. I'll let you read right off the slide, but I think from an external effort, concerted effort has been really built on how can we recruit more diverse perspectives, more diverse people into our organizations. We're having leadership, so you see CEOs, senior executive teams speaking about injustices, either worldly views as well as things that are happening within the country itself. And then internally, there's a lot of efforts, like, so we have healing circles, sharing circles, employee resource groups, which is a really great one for diversity groups or diversity colleagues to really network with one another that have similar lived experiences and to socialize with one another. And then another great one is land acknowledgements. Of course, we did one today, but we're seeing a lot of that happen at beginning of meetings, and not just for your major ones where you have 100 people, but even meetings of 10 or more colleagues, which again is fantastic to see. Next slide. So I wanted to talk about cultural competence because, again, you know, if you've lived in the city of Toronto, you know, you'd be no stranger to lots of diversity, you know, walking along the streets where you went to school, in the organizations you work for. But however, just really want to, there's just, you know, I think I'm learning constantly every day in this job, in this role, and, you know, everyone has a different lived experience. So even if a group identifies as being you know, from the same religion or from the same race or background, I think their stories can be completely different. So I think it's important from the humanitarian standpoint to think about there's no just one homogeneous group. Everyone has different differences, even in the fact that we bucket potentially some similarities or commonalities. But I think to be really culturally competent from an individual standpoint, it's that set of behaviors and attitudes really that include, you know, and that's including policies that work together among individuals within a workplace that enable people to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So what I mean when I say that is that when you're in a group of different minded people, is that you have this opportunity to, you know, maybe disagree or have differing viewpoints, but still be able to have really good conversations around the solutions that you're coming up with, the creative marketing strategies that you're doing, or the idea generation really of, you know, this is what I think might work, but let's take, you know, let's really think about what John, Sarah, and Patricia have to say, and they could be all vastly different, but you come to a, you know, a greater solution because you all brought in your perspectives. And so that cultural competency piece really implies that there's an integrated pattern of human behavior really that allows thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values really, and that can shape institutional knowledge, but also groupthink. And groupthink is something that we really want to get away from in the conversations that we have in and outside the workplace, even with our peers. And that's really when there's this practice of thinking or making decisions in a way that discourages creativity or individual responsibility. And there's always a danger when we have a lot of like-minded people come together. So too leaders as well that are super alike, because it's a psychological phenomenon really that occurs within groups that desire for harmony or conformity really take place and can actually act on making irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcomes when there's too much similarity within that group. And so again, super important to know when you're starting to see that, when you're coming together to brainstorm with one another. And we know this to be true when we think about diversity and inclusion, that diverse teams consistently outperform homogeneous ones, especially ones that are tasked with creative, creative, nonlinear, or complex decision-making properties. So again, in fact, I think the top 25% most diverse companies generate around 53% more return on equity than least diverse companies. And so another study found that racial and gender diversity correlate with greater sales revenue, more customers, and higher profit. So again, it's that little bit of business case, but I think it just, you know, builds off the idea that the more diverse we are at the table, the better off we'll be. And then also it's important that we respect each other's views, outputs, and perspectives in those meetings. And so being cognizant of our unconscious bias of maybe when we start to shut down ideas or, you know, the levels of where people are coming with their perspectives, is that a leader should really take it upon themselves to make sure that everyone has had a chance to speak. And so that's what's really important when we think about being a culturally competent organization, a culturally competent household, a culturally competent relationship that you have, because again, it's really transferable, not just within the workplace, but outside that workplace too. And, you know, I think if people are interested on this topic, how can I, you know, the question could be, how could I become more culturally competent? There's a lot of great material online that's free to like start to explore your own historical roots, beliefs, values. You can take unconscious bias tests to see how biased you are in your ratings and what you can do to really reflect as an individual. So it's really about learning about yourself, being self-aware and self-reflective. Learning about different cultures. You came to hear Leni and I speak today. That's one great example of, you know, understanding different cultures, interacting with diverse groups. So the next time you're thinking about mentoring or sponsoring someone, maybe look for someone that's not like you, or, you know, have an idea of maybe pursuing someone that's very diverse and outside of your, let's say, your first or second network of people that you may interact with. Attend diversity focused conferences. That's a big one. I love to do that. And really lobbying for your department or other diverse groups, I think is a really great way to be an ally. But when you go into those circles, you start to really understand different lived experiences than your own. The other thing I wanted to chat really about really quickly is bias. Leni, I think you might be on the slide already. Yes, perfect. And oh my goodness, it's already 11:30. I wanted us to have a little bit more of a conversational thing, a conversation or fireside chat. So I'll be really quick with these last couple slides, but you know, there are lots of research and statistics around bias. You know, so it just goes back to my point around stereotyping. I've been a recruiter for a long period of time of my career. So I think about, you know, some of these biases that show up in the workplace. And it's, you know, when we think about interviewing someone for a role, we can also pivot that to when we start to get to know, you know, peers, maybe growing our teams, but as well as even who we want to have in our friend group when we have an interaction. Has some of these biases come to life in terms of, you know, your first impression is a big one. In that 30 seconds, has someone, you know, made eye contact with you? How was their handshake? I know we're still in COVID time, so I don't know if handshakes are still taking place, but a lot of that inconsistency of, you know, what it is we're comfortable with in the interactions that we've had professionally or personally can sometimes translate into maybe a diversity thought or group or person that's in front of you that might not have the same sort of experiences. And then you immediately think, oh, this is someone that I don't, you know, want to hire, or this is someone that I don't want to maybe invite to an event that I'm hosting. And so I put a couple here in terms of affinity, perception, the halo effect, confirmation bias. I think if you have time today, really take a look at some of what these are. I won't have too much time today to probably go through all the biases that I had, but here's a couple other ones. As I mentioned, even though there's a halo effect, there's also something called a horn effect. There's cultural noise. There's nonverbal bias. We have contrast bias, similar to me bias, central tendency is a bias. And then, so again, there's so much that takes place, I think, in a lot of interactions that we have something called an expectation anchor. And again, if I had more time, I would really, really go through all of these definitions with you. But I think high level, you know, the most important thing to get out of the slide is that, you know, being conscious of them or not, we know that they continuously happen. And as much as, you know, we try to, this idea around unconscious bias, whether it's unconscious or implicit, it really just associates that we have associations in our brains that we hold outside of our conscious awareness and our control. And what happens is that, you know, this is very much, you know, from historical time frame, our brains would, you know, would do this from a protection or safety standpoint, but now, you know, we are safe, but we still kind of have them wired in our brains to think about, we're triggered by certain things that people say, tone of voice, a lot of nonverbal cues. And again, our brain will automatically, in seconds, without consciously knowing, will make quick sound judgments and assessments on people. And again, it's just something that is continuous. So we have to really think about when we're making decisions, you know, and we say, this person's not fit. Recruiters, a people manager, or individually just think about why maybe was I triggered by something that they said, and kind of do a little bit more internal reflection on when we say someone's not fit, what do we mean by not fit? And like think about all of the biases that, you know, we currently have today, and think, is there something that from my perspective, I might have, you know, misjudged that person in front of me. And so again, just something to be cognizant of for sure. And number 9, which is just around a little bit around microaggressions, because I think this is super important. And again, a microaggression is a comment or action that negatively can target a marginalized group of people. And microaggressions can be intentional or accidental, and it's a form of discrimination. So again, people who use microaggressions may mean no harm toward that person or that group that it's used against. But they also may not even realize that they've made a microaggressive comment or action. And so there are different forms of microaggressions. So you have verbal, and a verbal microaggression is a comment or question that is hurtful or stigmatizes a certain marginalized group. And so I'm going to give you examples. So for example, one could be, "You're so smart for a woman," would be an example of a verbal microaggression. A behavioral one would be, occurs when someone behaves in a way that is hurtful or discriminatory to a certain group of people. So an example of a behavioral microaggression could be a bartender ignoring a transgendered person and instead serving a cisgender person, and that could be someone whose biological sex matches their identity first. An environmental microaggression is when a subtle discrimination occurs within a society. And one example of an environmental microaggression could be that a college campus only has buildings named after, let's say, Caucasian people, and don't have any diversity of naming throughout the campus itself. A micro assault is when a person intentionally behaves in a discriminatory way while not intending to be offensive. So an example of a micro assault could be a person in an office or in an environment telling a racist joke, but then says, "Oh, I was just joking." A micro insult is a comment or action that is unintentionally discriminatory. For example, this could be a person, this could be a person saying to an Indian doctor, "Your people must be so proud." A micro invalidation is when a person could make a comment that invalidates or undermines their experience to a certain group of people. And so an example of a micro invalidation could be that a Caucasian person telling a person of color that racism doesn't exist today in society. And so again, there are, I could give many more examples of this, but just, knowing the differences of these things, and then also speaking out when we see these in and outside the office is super, super important to do from an allyship standpoint. So again, that's, I think what I wanted to leave the group with was just some terminology, some thoughts, and the differences between microaggressions. And I'll pass it to Leni to see if we can do some Q&A. And if she had any particular questions for me.
Thank you so much, Krystal. I'm so sorry I need to work on my slide presentation skills, but thank you for your patience, and we found our groove. You covered so much. This is obviously a really large topic, but in the time that we had, you really gave a lot of good foundational information that I think will generate some good conversation, and of course that people can build on as they continue the learning journey that, you know, it's a never-ending learning journey that it takes all of us to continually, you know, work this concept into not just our workplaces and organizations, but into our life. Okay, so I'm just double checking. We've got some in the comments, but I'll lead with one of mine. So I think this is a leading question, but I'd like to go back to the quote that I started with at the beginning that came from the International Women's Day website, which is, the quote was, "Whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. Knowing that bias exists isn't enough. Action is needed to level the playing field." So, you know, would you agree that this statement doesn't just apply to women, and that it's, you know, I think it was intentional on the part of the FEO team to have us here doing this conversation today? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a hard question, but I think it's an important one. And I couldn't agree more with the sentiment that, you know, I think we're all human. And so that's something that I always try to focus on from that humanitarian standpoint, that instead of focusing on our differences, we should unite and think more about our commonalities and our similarities. And, you know, I think, you know, from that standpoint, even when we have disagreements or arguments, or this is important too, I think, when a mistake has been made, because we're all on our learning journeys, and we're all at different stages of our inclusion journeys as well, is that when, you know, there has been something that's taken place, is that we right that wrong. And we can only do that from a place of having an open heart and an open mind. And I think that's the most important piece, is that, you know, we rectify that, we do it soon, and we do it with the best intentions, because again, that's the learning that can come out of it. I think an organization that really opens the door to having more inclusion conversations, with that a bit of risk, but also the greatest reward in learning from one another and understanding where each other come from, will only progress us to this next level of inclusivity that we need to be at, not just for our generations, but for the next generations that follow us. So I hope that answers your question, but I think it is meant for everybody, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was a great answer. And it's funny because I had a direct question in the chat, which I think you already answered, and that was looking for some guidance. So, you know, if you've accidentally made one of those comments, like that were, you know, examples that you gave of microaggressions, which I think is pretty common. It's those little things that have big impact that are often unintentional. And the question was, what's an appropriate sort of non-defensive response? But I really think that you did touch on some of those themes. Would you add anything to what you've already said?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And being someone that works in human resources, I've seen this go so many different ways. But it's, I think, so important for organizations, like I said, to bring that authenticity piece. Because imagine in a group setting or in a meeting, where it's, you know, someone's been slighted or there's been a comment made, like to have it addressed in an open forum where both people agree that, you know, what, that was not my intention. I didn't even actually know that I was doing that. And then, you know, get to an understanding where people can see it, witness it, and that the leaders are also very in tune to say, you know, I've made a mistake. That's my bad. Let's work on making it better. I think that is the right way, and probably the most progressive way, as opposed to when you're in a meeting, you stay silent, and then you go through this process within HR. And that's okay too. It just means that your organization is not in a place yet to really welcome that conversation. However, I'm seeing like more organizations going through this D&I model of like leaders are really owning their mistakes, or their, you know, it's ignorance. But I think like a lot of that is also, let's give more training and development opportunities. Let's have sharing circles take place. But I think to nip it right when it takes place, and not say like, oh, let's do something in 2 weeks, or let's have a mediation. It's just like the faster you can get to the conversation, a genuine conversation, understanding, the better off both colleagues will be. And so I think also when you notice it right away that you've done it, be like, you know what, I made a mistake. I just noticed I made a mistake. I apologize for doing that. And I still do that today. Like sometimes I don't use gender. Like sometimes I'll be like, hey guys, and I'll immediately be like, I apologize. I've just made a mistake. And then, I think that progressiveness of and being proactive, but also reactive in certain moments is the best way.
That's very relatable. I had been trying to take you guys out of my vocabulary, and the more I tried to do that and thought about it, I found the more I was saying it. So I did find myself then like apologizing for it all the time. And I think you touched on another topic that maybe we can add to the list of things for people to maybe do some research about, which is this intention versus impact. It's really important that we recognize impact. It's not just about your intentions were good. If there was a negative impact, which often can only be judged from the person who's on the receiving end, it's really important, like you said, to be open and humble to learning from that. And it's not just about what your intention was, but what the impact was. I'm going to ask one more question, and then Dave or anyone else, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. But I think something that's going to be relevant for the audience is how might these, when a corporation takes on the process of really learning about DEI, having a strategy, building those structures internally, and really working on it as an organization, how can that translate outwards through the work that they do, how they interact with customers? And in this case, if you have anything to say specifically about festivals and events, or even tourism products, how will those internal DEI efforts translate into a better output?
Fantastic question. I could probably do another lecture on just that. But really, I think we live in a different society where we're not necessarily always relying on the brand to tell the story. We listen to people. And we also know statistically we tend to tell more of our negative stories. I think 80% we tell our negative stories, and only 20% we tell our positive ones. And so, when we think about statistics just around that, it's so important from a risk standpoint that we ensure and we focus on doing the right thing internally and in-house. And so when we can understand, and work on our inclusion strategy, that not only helps build the employee value proposition for why people would want to work for your organization. If your CEO is loud and proud and, makes it part of his mission or her mission, really, to say, we're not going to stand for these injustices. We want a diversity and inclusion workforce, one that respects and values everyone at the table. You build a really fantastic culture where I think people feel like they can, they want to come to work. They want to share their own experiences with you. They want to share their history, and all like who they are as people. And I think that translates into, I think I talked a little bit about the business case, but you want 100% participation of the group coming to your festivals, right? And so that means that we translate, our value proposition for all groups. So again, it's like, if you're only targeting just, an age demographic, you're missing out. Or like, let's say you're only targeting, let's just say for this instance, maybe just females, you're missing 50% of the population that come to that festival. And, you think about all these other diversity groups, it's a huge portion. But when you're 100% into diversity and inclusion, that means you have 100% potentially externally, you can be marketing why people would want to attend, why people would want to be a part of your organization. And so I think 100% participation, really, that's the business, I think from an executive standpoint, like you want that, right? So being able to translate that for all the different segments and groups, that's really key. And ensuring that, you don't just umbrella D&I as one group, is that you have subject matter experts who can target and pivot and do work with LGBTQ2+, that can do work with people of color, that can do work with Indigenous communities, persons with disabilities, or diverse abilities. And so that's something that, you know, I leave the group with too, is just there's an immense opportunity, I think, to do work with all of the segments, but being able to understand the segments is also very important instead of putting it all under one group.
Great answer. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here, Krystal, with a question or a comment, and just wondering, in your opinion, what has, you know, we've been working on diversity inclusion for a long time now, and, you know, I think we're starting to see some gains, but I think in the last couple of years, it's kind of gone backwards. And I'm wondering, has social media lent to that? And you know, I think of your confirmational bias and you know, your microaggressions, and you know, you can look on the internet or social media and find your camp where you want to pitch your tent, and you've got all kinds of other campers who share your stories. And has that taken us backwards rather than forwards?
In some ways, sometimes I think when we segregate a little bit too much the groups, that's where I see sometimes we're going backwards. Because I always preface on, it's not about, you know, you have to have immense understanding of all the different diversity segments, but you also have to, you know, at some degree, cultivate this belonging with everyone. And so I think if you just focus on maybe one segment per se, or you isolate it by itself, that's going to be where you're like, I think you start to label, and not everyone's coming together from that cohesion standpoint. So that's why when I say always being loud and always having that on approach means that if you're going to celebrate all religions, make sure that you celebrate all religions in external media, in internal communications that you have. If you're going to celebrate days of note or you know, days of significance for one group, is that you do it for all groups. So again, it's super important that when you cast that net, you have to ensure that you're not just like focused on one, but you have all of them there. And so that colleagues can learn about all these different races, ethnicities, religions, and lived experiences, but that you don't just focus on one, because that's where sometimes you get into these situations where it's like, we've done so much for one diversity group, but we don't do anything for this group. And so sometimes that, I think, is where maybe you'll see some pushback from one community to the next. But I always say, just try to bring intersectionality to all of the events that you have, right? So don't just focus, like, because there's so many things that I can be an Indigenous person, but I can also be a woman. And then, you know, can we talk about things that are intersectional with diversity? I think that's a piece that it's still bringing all diverse groups together to the conversation, and shedding that light and understanding.
And what about traditional media? Like, I come from a background in journalism, and quite frankly, the last couple of years, I'm disgusted by journalism, both in you know, the States and in Canada. And you know, there's no more presenting facts as a you know, a biased or a non-biased observer. You know, they're taking angles and they're taking sides, and it's really split the country, really. You know, what do we do there? I mean, I've been on several journalistic forums and stuff that everybody shares that same opinion, but how do you get the organizations through that biased opinion?
Journalism is such an interesting topic. Media is such an interesting topic. And I completely agree with you that it is sometimes splitting, or they have their own agenda, if I can put it that way. And again, I want to keep it as nonpartisan as I can here, but I think, you know, questioning the authorities or journalism, you know, it's the masses that bring together the, you know, this perception of that media needs to change that storyline, and or, you know, that it's not valid what's taking place. So I think lobbying or having groups of individuals come to the table to say, like, that's not the correct story, or you know, even questioning or having authorities be not prosecuted, but at least, you know, brought to light some of the information that they're providing, like mass society. So, it's difficult to say. Like I see it, and I see them perpetuating stereotypes. I see a lot wrong with our media system in the US and Canada too, but I think, it's from that perspective, it's, everyone has, that not everyone's an informed perspective reading what they, or taking in what they get from the media. So it's a really tricky and complex question, but I think everyone has to fight that battle of misinformation, and there's so much of that out there already, and there will continue to be. But I think getting people more informed about diversity and inclusion, getting more education and awareness and training and development to the average Canadian will help, I think, equalize the other side of what people are perpetuating, which is, sometimes that misinformation that you were talking about.
So Krystal and Leni, we're getting near the end of our session time. Last words from both of you for people that are just starting down the diversity highway, or that are partway down, words of encouragement moving forward.
I mean, I'll start and I'll let Leni leave us with some final thoughts here. But what I could say is I'd love for all of you to stay connected to me via LinkedIn or whatever social channels that you have. I try to share as much content and information that I can. There's no such thing as a silly question in my eyes, just working in diversity and inclusion for the last decade. And I think just questioning, Dave, to your point, maybe some of the information that you get is just fact checking, really going on research, statistics, and really the primary sources versus secondary and third sources would be important. But yeah, just stay connected, stay informed. It was an absolute pleasure getting to tell a little bit about my story to you. So hopefully this won't be the last time that we chat. Thanks for having me.
And Leni?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know we were asked in the questions, and I committed that that list of terminology that Krystal mentioned. I'll get it to you, Dave, and you can share it with the group so they can reference it after this presentation is over. And yeah, to echo what Krystal said, it's a learning journey. You just have to be open and committed to continue learning. And I think part of that can also be, it doesn't have to be research. It doesn't have to be a lot of book learning, official courses. All of that is good. But I find that even consuming entertainment that comes from different perspectives, CBC has a lot of Indigenous TV shows. You can read books by different authors. Many of them are Canadian, many of them are from Toronto, fiction stories. So you can work in those different perspectives into so many different ways of your life. It doesn't have to just be in this particular learning or corporate space. So just be open and just keep doing it. And thank you so much for having us.
Krystal and Leni, thanks very much. A lot of things to think about, and I think a lot more sessions to come to help us all through this process. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's now our honor to present our second of 4 Hall of Fame awards. We really want to acknowledge their accomplishments in person, in front of their peers, and we will when we're all together again soon. Until then, our second FEO Hall of Famer.
This year, FEO is pleased to induct 4 outstanding individuals. These individuals will join 43 of their industry colleagues who have made a significant contribution to their communities. It's our pleasure to introduce to you our second inductee into the FEO Hall of Fame. Raya Shadursky. From the Bloor West Village Toronto Ukrainian Festival, welcome Raya to the Festivals and Events Ontario Hall of Fame. The festival celebrated its 25th anniversary in September 2021, and Raya has been a staple of this festival since its inception. She was the very first executive director and has mentored 3 other directors over the past 25 years. Raya has a wealth of knowledge and is always happy, willing, and able to help whenever she's called upon. Over the years, she has come to know many of the vendors, volunteers, supporters, and staff, and has always been a huge support to all of them. Raya was also the executive director of the Mississauga Ukrainian Festival for 5 years. She's dedicated so much of her personal time and energy over the past 25 years for this festival and has helped it grow from 500 attendees to approximately 700,000 people. Raya is a rare gem within her community, and we are so happy to have her in the FEO Hall of Fame.
Raya, from all of us at Festival Events Ontario, congratulations on a great life's work. And, you know, our thoughts and prayers are with you and all of the Ukraine people and the injustices that they're going through currently. You know, we think of you, your communities, and, you know, our thoughts and prayers are with you to hopefully a peaceful solution to this terrible problem over in Ukraine. You know, FEO, Festivals and Events Ontario, would like to thank our sponsors for helping making Energize happen. Without you, we couldn't do it. We'd like to thank the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism and Cultural Industries, Destination Ontario, OLG, SmartServe, and Ticket Pro. Until Thursday, thank you everybody. Enjoy your week.